Hi, I'm David Valdez, and I teach AP Human Geography at Cherry Creek High School in Greenwood Village, Colorado. Today's video will discuss how agricultural practices are influenced by the physical environment and climatic conditions, such as Mediterranean climates and tropical climates. What will we learn? Well, agriculture is influenced by the physical environment, and all plants have certain requirements that they need in order to grow and thrive. First of all, plants need space. They need suitable room to grow, or they'll have to compete for resources with other plants. Secondly, they need light. Plants need sufficient light in order to perform photosynthesis. Plants need water to help absorb nutrients like phosphate and nitrogen. And plants need their nutrients like phosphate and nitrogen for their nourishment so that they can grow. Lastly, plants need a suitable temperature so that they can grow their best. These types of crops grown will vary according to climatic factors and physical geography. Agriculture is influenced by the physical environment. In a climate like a cold mid-latitude climate, which is found in north central the United States or southern Canada or even eastern Europe, we're going to see things like the grasses, wheat, barley, and cows, livestock, dairy cows, those sorts of animals that are going to be grown. In warm mid-latitudes like southern China or the southern United States, we will see all sorts of different types of vegetables, fruits, and even rice. In a Mediterranean climate is a special climate which is really only found in a few places around the world. California, Chile, the Mediterranean Sea area are three of those places. Those places are suitable for growing grapes, olives, dates, and even figs. In a grasslands or continental steppe climate where it's semi-arid or very dry, like in northern Africa, the western United States grasslands, or even in Mongolia, you're going to find cattle ranching, sheep, goats, horses, camels, mostly animals that graze. A subtropical climate, which is found in places like the West Indies or even in Indonesia, you'll see rice, cotton, tobacco, a lot of the plantation crops, as you will also in the tropical climate, which is found in equatorial Africa and Indonesia, where you'll see coffee, sugar, tea, cacao, and even pineapple grown on large plantations. Humans can support some of the plant's needs in order to make up deficiencies. For example, human modifications include things like clearing more land or modifying land so crops have more room. This could include planting crops in areas that were transitional lands between dry lands and cropland so that we can have more crops to grow. Humans can provide artificial grow lights to aid photosynthesis, especially in places like greenhouses. And in Northern Europe, they use greenhouses a lot because the days get short, especially in the winter. Humans irrigate crops using water if the water supply is deficient or sporadic. And humans can add fertilizer to nourish plants so that they can grow quickly. And lastly, humans will grow crops in greenhouses and other buildings in order to maintain a constant temperature. These modifications are an example of environmental possibilism that you probably learned about in Unit 1. Some plants, though, are constrained by the environment. Specialized crops, such as Mediterranean crops or even tropical crops, can only be grown in certain areas because of the economies of scale. The climatic conditions needed to grow these crops can be replicated, but not at the scale that we need in order to grow make a profit. So we can make a suitable environment for bananas or another tropical crop, but we can't do it on a scale that's large enough in order to make a profit from those bananas. It's best to just grow the bananas in the tropical climate. Areas with these types of climates are often used to grow only these specialized crops, often at the expense of local food crops. Let's practice. Which of the following best explains the importance of climate to agricultural practices? A. Mid-latitude climates tend to support similar agricultural crops and practices, such as wheat farming in the United States and China. B. Agricultural crops are successful only in mid-latitude climates where any crop can be grown. C. Tropical climates support plant-based agriculture, but animal-based agriculture is not successful in tropical areas. D. The sparse vegetation in arid and semi-arid climates does not support animal-based agriculture. Or E. Cold mid-latitude climates are associated with plantation agriculture and pastoral nomadism. The answer is A. Mid-latitude climates tend to support similar agricultural crops and practices such as wheat farming in the United States and China. What should we take away? Well, agriculture is dependent on climate and physical geography, so crops are grown best in climates and soils that support that crop. However, humans can modify the environment to grow crops in areas that might normally be unsuitable for that crop. It is your job as a geographer to know how and where humans have modified the earth to make growing agriculture easier. Thank you. Hi, I'm David Valdez, and I teach AP Human Geography at Cherry Creek High School in Greenwood Village, Colorado. Today's video will discuss how intensive farming practices include market gardening, plantation agriculture, and mixed crop and livestock systems. What will we learn? Agriculture can be characterized as intensive or extensive. Intensive agricultural systems require a large amount of labor and capital. They use small plots of land, usually located near large populations, and they are characterized by a high yield per acre. Examples of intensive agricultural systems include rice, milk, and truck farming. Extensive agricultural systems are characterized by low capital and low labor inputs. They are usually large plots of lands that are away from population centers, and they're characterized by low yield per acre. Examples here include shifting cultivation and livestock ranching. Agriculture is influenced by economic factors. Farmers must decide what and how to farm based on financial considerations, things like the cost of the land. Expensive land means the farmer can't afford to have as much land and must generate sufficient revenue to make money off the land. The cost of labor is also important. High cost of labor or the need for a lot of farm workers drives up costs and makes it necessary for farmers to generate higher revenues and profits. The cost of machinery is also an important step because machinery is a high initial investment, but it can save money in the long run. Here are some types of intensive agriculture. Plantation agriculture. These are labor-intensive agricultural systems that exploit cheap labor in the former colonies. Crops like coffee, cacao, sugar, and other cash crops are raised and sold to developed areas. Mixed crop and livestock systems are labor-intensive systems where farmers grow crops in order to fatten livestock for slaughter. Corn and soybeans are farmed and then fed to cattle and pigs in feedlots, which are then slaughtered in labor-intensive meat packing plants. And market gardening. Market gardening farms are farms that specialize in fresh fruits and vegetables that are transported to the market pretty frequently. Products like grapes, lettuce, potatoes, and more are planted and harvested, often using migrant labor. Types of extensive agriculture include shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation is when farmers in the tropics control a large area of land, but they only clear a part of it at one time in order to farm. The rainforest is cleared and burned, and farmers plant many different crops in the field. Because the soil loses its fertility after only a few years, the farmers have to start the process over. Nomadic herding is another type of extensive agriculture. Nomadic herders graze cattle, sheep, goats, horses, and even more in arid and semi-arid climates. The herders are mobile and they move with their animals from pasture to pasture, which means that they don't need a whole lot of workers, but they also don't have a whole lot of possessions or accumulation of wealth because they have to move so often. And there's ranching. Ranchers own large areas of land for grazing cattle and sheep to sell on the markets. Ranch land is usually unsuitable for farming, so the land is less expensive than farmland. Let's practice. Sheep production in New Zealand and poultry production in Arkansas produce food animals for human consumption. Which of the following best describes the differences in the agricultural practices and land use for these products? A. Sheep production is an example of intensive agriculture requiring large amounts of fertilizer, whereas poultry production is an example of extensive agriculture practiced mainly in more developed countries. B. Sheep production and poultry production are both examples of extensive agriculture practiced on large areas of land, but requiring different climates. C. Sheep production is an example of extensive agriculture requiring large pastures, whereas poultry production is an example of intensive agriculture often practiced indoors. D. Sheep production and poultry production are both examples of intensive agriculture practiced on small areas of land, but requiring different amounts of labor and capital. Or E. Sheep production is an example of extensive agriculture that is declining because of an insufficient supply of open land, whereas poultry production continues to be practiced on small areas of land. The answer is C. Sheep production is an example of extensive agriculture requiring large pastures, whereas poultry production is an example of intensive agriculture often practiced indoors. So, what should we take away? Well, agriculture is characterized as intensive or extensive. Farmers make economic decisions based on plot size, labor costs, and machinery costs. Intensive farming involves small plots and high yields, while extensive farming involves large plots and low yields. It's your job as a geographer to understand the types of farms that exist across all scales and why those farms are located there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kristen Brandt, and today we're going to be talking about settlement patterns and survey methods. I'm new to AP Daily, and so I want to just share a little bit about myself. I teach at Glenbard West High School in Glen Ellen, Illinois, just west of Chicago. But there's more to me than just living outside of Chicago. My plan is, as we are moving through our AP Daily lessons, is to integrate some of my experiences into these lessons. For example, today we're going to focus on different rural settlement patterns and methods of surveying rural settlements. So let me actually start with this. Let's start with a mental map. Picture yourself in the Northwestern Hemisphere. Climate's humid continental. Can you picture the Great Plains? The breadbasket? Okay, let's narrow it down. How about, can you picture cornfields, Caucasus, or how about the Hawkeyes? Those of you that were able to put us in Iowa, fantastic. So I have family in Iowa. And so as we're building this idea of settlement patterns and survey methods and exploring it, I thought back to my family. And that's where I want to show you some of those connections of things that you might witness if you fly over places such as Iowa or fly over other places around the world. So let's take a visual experience together. Today, what are we going to learn? Well, we're going to learn, what do I mean by these settlement patterns? So in particular, rural. We're going to talk about clustered settlements. So what we're talking about here is this was kind of a settlement pattern that we saw throughout Europe. And you see how the homes are really kind of all near one another? Well, that idea of clustering them, gathering them together, really was an idea of helping them to create a sense of community and then the shared resources outside of that area. Another settlement pattern that we talk about is dispersed. And we do find this one more in North America. And notice how we see the buildings kind of spread throughout this image here. So while the community maybe is not as connected, you are more connected to those resources or your farmland. The third type of rural settlement pattern that we want to explore is the linear settlement. And so take a look at this. It's going to develop along transportation systems, so either a road or a river, and you're going to see those buildings kind of develop all along that. I know our names get really creative here at Human Geo, right? Clustered, all together, dispersed, spread out, linear like a line. But it's more than just those terms. And so that's what we're going to explore today. How did we get here? What were these survey methods? And so one of the survey methods that was used, and we saw this primarily used in England, was this meets and bounds. Typically, this was for us to mark and survey short distances using landmarks such as landscape or buildings. Growing up in rural Wisconsin, we use this concept of communicating quite a bit. Take a turn at the big red barn. But what this allowed us to do with meets and bounds was really kind of define people's space. The long lot, we saw this in France a lot. And this again is going to connect back to that river. And the idea was that everybody would have access to the same goods and the same type of land as it branched out from the river. However, when we moved to North America, we needed things a little more structured because we had all this wide open space. How do we divide it up? And so what we did is we used more of a survey method, so a grid-like pattern versus using the landmarks of a river, just using the river or just using the trees or just using the buildings. And so this grid system really came about when we saw the Land Ordinance of 1785. Not going to test you on that. I would be familiar with the concept of township and range. What we come from that is these 6x6 squares. And in this case, we see a mile by mile. And what's nice by this is you can see how we can divide it up even further, but in this grid-like pattern. But again, this is all pretty abstract. What we want to do is look at some examples. What does it look like in the real world? Why do we care? As we know, geographers are really concerned with spatial distribution, and what does it mean? So let's take a look at that clustered village again. What might that look like in the real world? So look at the overlay of this image. This image is in Europe. If we take it away, there's our village. This is going to put all of our resources together. Sounds great, right? We can gather, we can work together, but then the hard part is that we see some farmland that's close, but other people might have farmland that's further away. Kind of one-stop shopping though, when we come into town, everything's here. A dispersed village, this is what we saw a lot in North America as well. We see this grid-like pattern start to develop because people get tired of traveling to and from their farmland. And so we might have one community, one little rural downtown, but we're going to see these kind of spread throughout the countryside. And so here's an example. Take a look in the background here, and you're going to see kind of how it's spread out and start to see that grid-like pattern. Now the linear village, this one's pretty fun to take a look at. The idea is that we all have access to the same transportation systems. Take a look what it might look like in the real world. But here's the deal. Those that live on one end versus the other end, depending how long this is, it might take longer to communicate, it might take longer to get goods to and from some areas. So where does that connect with our survey methods? Let's take a look at meets and bounds. We have some landmarks. Maybe they're physical features. Maybe they're buildings. And then from there, we can draw out those boundaries. And you'll see when we look at this that it becomes a little bit more, not as evenly shaped, but it's going to reflect that family, that community, their needs. Township and range gives us that really kind of that grid-like pattern that we were just talking about. And so those grids are really what we start to see as we move westward in the United States. Constantly kind of overlaying and breaking them apart. Take a look at this view. Can you see the squares, the rectangles? Do you see the grids? The long lot, here's our river, there's even a road. But then we take a look at where do we kind of set up those farms? The objective here was to balance off those resources as you moved away from the river or from the transportation system. Let's practice. Kind of threw a lot at you, 6 new vocab terms. And so one of the things we could focus on is which of the following is the land survey method system shown in the satellite image. Hopefully, you look at this and you see those squares, rectangles, that grid system, and you're able to identify that as the township and range. So what should we take away? Well, the first thing is we need to be able to identify. Can you identify clustered, dispersed, or linear settlements? Can you identify survey methods, meets and bounds, township and range, long lots? But it's more than that. Are you able to compare? Are you able to talk about when I see the long lots, that I also am seeing a linear? When I'm seeing the township and range, that I'm seeing dispersed? What we're ultimately seeing is the impact on the cultural landscape. I can see those images that man has created as we've developed, as we've progressed throughout society. So what we're going to do as we're looking at future units is we're going to start to look at how did those systems and settlements start to impact our agricultural options, and then also where we are today as far as development. I want to thank you for tuning in today and listening to our lesson on